"You fired the wrong damn person," I whispered, just loud enough for the janitor to hear as I dropped my security badge in the trash and stepped into the cold rain with a banker box full of my career and one rubber plant drooping like it knew the truth. Rewind 72 hours. Monday morning, right before 9 o'clock. I am halfway through a stale pastry and rerouting a supply chain emergency. A polymer casing shipment is stuck in New Jersey because someone fat-fingered a zip code. The elevator dings and he walks inside. Not the man I respected, his son, Julian. The kind of kid who uses words like paradigm and synergy and has never once stapled his own resume. He saunters out like a perfume ad, wearing custom Italian loafers, pants that are way too tight, and a jawline sharpened by absolute nepotism. Our receptionist practically swoons as the prodigal heir returns. He does not shake hands. He does not say good morning. He just marches into the bullpen and yells that he wants all department heads in the main conference room in 10 minutes tops. Then he disappears into his glass box like he has an Emmy-winning monologue to rehearse. We shuffle in like condemned livestock. The first sentence out of his mouth sets the tone. He says this place runs like a retirement home, and that ends today. He claims they do not reward slackers, and if you are not building value, you are dragging down costs. Now, I have survived 3 corporate mergers, 1 embezzlement scandal, a blackout that killed half our data servers, and a holiday party that went horribly wrong. But absolutely nothing prepared me for the smirk he gave me when he locked eyes with me. That slow, rehearsed, arrogant smirk. The kind of smirk that says he read my salary, and it made him feel powerful to cut it. I did not blink. I did not flinch, but I knew the guillotine was already being wheeled inside. My name is Richard. I am 55 years old. I spent 32 years building the backbone of Apex Dynamics. I built the vendor network from scratch. That night, I stayed late, not to catch up on invoices. I was erasing things. Personal touches, old notes, vendor contact files I had memorized anyway. My desk went from lived-in to an abandoned motel room in 20 silent minutes. Then I left a flash drive taped under my keyboard. Tuesday morning, 10 o'clock, Human Resources calls. They ask if we can chat real quick. Sure, why not? Let us euthanize loyalty over free coffee in the beige interrogation room they call a wellness suite. They fed me some legally pre-chewed line about organizational agility and how my role has evolved past necessity. I was encouraged to pursue external opportunities. Translation: pack your dinosaur bones. The boy king wants his sandbox entirely to himself. I did not argue, I did not plead. I asked one simple question. Is Julian signing the release? The HR director blinked, nodded, and handed me the paperwork. I grinned. Perfect. Because as I scanned the termination document, I noticed something incredible. The signature at the bottom belonged to Mr. Vance, the CEO. But I have seen Mr. Vance's signature 1,000 times over the last 3 decades. The loops were wrong. The pressure was off. Julian had forged his father's signature on a legally binding termination document. In the state of California, forgery under Penal Code Section 470 renders a contract void ab initio, null and void from the very beginning. Furthermore, he was firing 25 senior staff members at once without a 60-day notice, a direct violation of the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, the Warnin Act. Julian just handed me a loaded gun, and he did not even realize the safety was off. But I did not point it at him yet. I had bigger plans. Here is what Julian did not know. Last fall, Titan Polymers, the vendor we had used for 15 years, was one board vote away from total collapse. I personally renegotiated their contracts to keep their heads above water. They called me the quiet savior. I called it a standard Tuesday. But Julian, he had absolutely no idea that without Titan, 70% of our production pipeline goes completely dry. The casings, the molds, the custom components, they do not magically appear in a drone drop. They come from one quiet, underfunded, desperate company clinging to one major client, which is us. And I knew exactly how to make that desperation mine. I packed my box, took my $85,000 severance package, and walked out the door with a plan burning in my chest. By Friday afternoon, I was sitting in Harold's garage with a bottle of premium bourbon and a manila envelope thick enough to choke a corporate lawyer. Harold is the owner of Titan Polymers. His face was redder than the whiskey label. He kept pacing, muttering Julian's name with pure venom. He looked at me, completely bewildered, asking how the hell this happened and pointing out that I had saved their entire operation just months prior. I did not answer immediately. I just pushed the envelope across his cluttered workbench right between an oil-stained vice grip and a half-eaten sandwich. He opened it, read the first page, and stopped breathing for a second. Inside was a buyout clause I had drafted with Elias, my brother-in-law, and a vicious part-time corporate attorney. I was offering to purchase 62% of Titan Polymers. Majority control, full board override, immediate transfer of all executive decisions, all funded by my $85,000 severance, my entire retirement pension, and a massive line of credit that would make a sane man weep. I looked Harold dead in the eye. I told him I did not want his vote. I wanted his silence and his trust. He stared at the documents, then nodded once, the way a drowning man does when someone hands him a rope made of heavy debt and fierce loyalty. We signed it right there on the hood of his old truck. By Saturday night, I owned the jugular of my former company. Quietly, legally, and irrevocably. There was no social media update, no press release. Just a silent corporate coup written in printer toner and bourbon sweat. I was now the absolute dictator of Titan Polymers. Sunday morning, I drafted an email to Julian. The subject line simply read, "Let us talk about the supply chain." There was no signature, no body text, just a PDF attachment containing the new pricing terms for Apex Dynamics. The rates were quadrupled. Payment was required strictly up front. A 30-day turnaround was mandated, with brutal financial penalties for late remittance. 3 hours went by with absolute radio silence. Then, late Sunday night, my phone buzzed. It was a blocked number. I answered on the third ring. Julian was on the other end, breathing heavily. He snapped that this was insane and that I did not have the authority to pull a stunt like this. I kept my voice calm and cold. I told him I am the authority. I suggested he check with his father, or better yet, avoid letting him find out on a Monday morning like I experienced. Then I hung up the phone. Monday morning, right after 9 o'clock, I walked into the Apex Dynamics lobby wearing the exact same boots I was fired while wearing. Only now, I had a visitor badge and a premium delivery folder stamped urgent. The receptionist blinked like she had just seen a ghost or karma wearing a winter coat. Julian spotted me from across the bullpen and turned the color of spoiled milk. He actually sprinted toward the main conference room to intercept me, but it was too late. That is when the elevator doors opened and his father, Mr. Vance, stepped out, the true CEO, the man who actually built the empire. He looked at me, then at his son, then at the heavy folder I handed to his executive assistant. He asked why Richard was here. No one spoke, so I did with a perfectly calm smile. I told him that his new acting executive liaison just terminated their biggest supplier, and he was currently looking at the new majority owner of that supplier. The room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Then Julian laughed. It was one of those high, nasal, desperate chuckles that sound like a balloon slowly deflating. He told his dad that I was bluffing, that it was just a desperate stunt from a disgruntled ex-employee. Mr. Vance did not listen to him. He opened the folder. He read the first page, flipped to the next, and then he screamed. It was a full-body, boardroom-shattering howl that sent 2 interns running for the emergency stairwell. He screamed at Julian, asking if he had seriously fired the new owner of their entire supply chain. I swear I saw the janitor clench his mop handle like a weapon, ready for a brawl. All I could do was smile and softly mention that I guess I was building value after all. Julian stood there looking like someone had just yanked his power cord right out of the wall. Julian's face was completely frozen. His lips were parted, and his eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal looking for an exit. Mr. Vance did not say a single word for 5 full seconds. He just stared at me, then down at the folder, then back at his son. He looked like he was trying to figure out if he was trapped in a nightmare, a hidden camera prank, or a full-on corporate execution. Finally, he snapped the folder shut and tossed it onto the receptionist's desk like it was glowing with radiation. He growled, demanding we move to conference room B immediately. Julian opened his mouth to defend himself, but his father shot him a glare that could melt steel, the kind of look that ends trust funds and revokes inheritances on the spot. We marched into the room, 3 men, 1 table, and a ticking time bomb of a contract. Mr. Vance dropped heavily into the chair at the head of the table. He rubbed his temples like he was massaging a migraine caused by 3 decades of terrible parenting decisions. He asked slowly, deliberately, why he was just finding out on a Monday morning that his company's most vital supplier was now owned by the very man his son had fired for being dead weight. Julian tried to regain his arrogant posture. He leaned back and claimed it was just a bluff. He insisted I did not have the capital to pull off a 62% buyout. I cut him off. My voice was like grinding gravel. I explained exactly how I leveraged my pension, my severance, and a massive line of credit through 3 holding companies. I told him the Titan Polymers board approved the transfer on Saturday morning, and I was the undisputed majority owner. I also casually mentioned that I had already rerouted 2 of their standing shipments to secondary buyers in the Midwest. Clients they had lost the previous year when Julian replaced half the senior account managers with an automated software subscription. Mr. Vance slowly turned to his son. He asked if Julian really let me take control of Titan. Julian actually started sweating. Large beads formed on his forehead. He stammered, claiming he had no visibility on the vendor's financial struggles. I reminded him that he had no visibility because he refuses to read anything longer than a tweet. He spends his days performing swagger in tailored suits and using corporate buzzwords, while the men who built the foundation were busy holding it together with duct tape. Mr. Vance stood up, the veins in his neck pulsing visibly. He yelled at Julian that he gave him 6 months to learn the ropes, and in less than a week, Julian had handed the steering wheel of the entire corporation to the only man who actually knew how the engine worked. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, Mr. Vance turned his attention back to me. His tone shifted completely. It was no longer a scolding, it was a desperate negotiation. He asked what I wanted. I slid a second envelope across the long table. It was not as thick as the first, but it carried 10 times the weight. Inside was the new vendor contract. It guaranteed the exact same quantities of materials, but at quadrupled prices, with brutal payment terms and a special clause. The clause explicitly stated that all executive liaison roles at Apex Dynamics must be formally approved by vendor leadership. And vendor leadership was me. Julian lunged across the table like he was going to snatch the folder, but his father slammed a heavy palm down, rattling the coffee mugs. He barked at his son to sit down and shut up. Mr. Vance looked at me, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He offered to put me back on the payroll, with a massive raise and a senior vice president title, if I just tore up the contract. I let out a sharp, cold laugh. I told him I was never coming back. I refused to clock in under leadership that views loyalty as a liability. I told him I was not going to rebuild a crumbling house just so the termites could live rent-free again. I stood up and buttoned my coat. I told him I would gladly supply the nails for his coffin, but at my price. Then I walked out. I did not look back, but I heard Julian's voice cracking as he asked his father if they were really going to let me own them. Mr. Vance's reply was cold as ice. He whispered that I already did. By Tuesday morning, the shockwave hit the corporate bloodstream. My phone was blowing up with emails from the procurement team and frantic calls from the finance department. I received a panicked message from Chloe, the young logistics coordinator, filled with crying emojis and begging for help. The news had leaked. Everyone knew Titan Polymers was under new leadership, and that leadership was not feeling particularly charitable toward the executives who had treated him like expired trash. But I was not reckless. This was not a chaotic revenge fantasy. It was a surgical strike. I did not burn their bridges. I bought the toll booths and started charging an absolute fortune to cross them. I officially froze all standing orders from Apex Dynamics until Mr. Vance signed the new terms. Quietly, I redirected essential components to 2 smaller startup companies I had been watching for years. Companies that Julian had openly mocked in board meetings for being too small to matter. It turns out, small and agile beats massive and bankrupt when your primary supplier is playing hardball. Apex Dynamics was suddenly staring down 3 dozen back orders and a massive penalty clause from their biggest client, out west. By Wednesday, the internal panic was turning into a bloodbath. The logistics director was screaming about missed quarterly timelines. The sales department was demanding to know why their parts were being shipped to random startups. And my personal favorite was a fully capitalized email from Mr. Vance himself, demanding I call him immediately. I ignored it. Instead, I spent my Wednesday afternoon drinking terrible diner coffee with Elias, plotting the next phase. I was targeting their second-tier vendors, the ones leveraged to the bone, operating on razor-thin margins. I used the initial cash flow from the quadrupled Apex invoices to start buying up minor competitors in neighboring states. I targeted mid-size, undervalued operations sitting on warehouse gold mines. I rebranded them all under one massive holding umbrella. I did not need a fancy public relations campaign. I just needed raw logistical power. A lot of red ink in their ledgers turned black the moment my signature hit the paper. Meanwhile, the executives at Apex Dynamics had absolutely no clue why their lead times were slipping across the board. They could not understand why their standard discount brackets had suddenly evaporated. A routine quote for 5,000 units now came with a 4-week delay and a brutal payment clause that explicitly stated all terms were at the discretion of the supplier principal. Every single delay, every price hike, every minor inconvenience in their daily operations belonged to me, and they felt the chokehold tightening every single day. By the end of the month, I received another call from Mr. Vance. This time, there was no barking, no posturing. He spoke with the kind of corporate humility that sounds like a man swallowing broken glass. He asked to propose a permanent solution. He offered a board seat and strategic control over their entire supply arm. He practically begged for my insight to help rebuild the company's strength. I did not give him an immediate answer. Instead, I scheduled a lunch meeting on neutral ground at a mid-tier steakhouse near the highway. I wore my oldest flannel shirt and brought a cheap yellow legal pad covered in scribbled numbers just to remind him who still worked for a living. Mr. Vance showed up in a bespoke suit, looking exhausted. He tried to open with small talk about the weather and golf. I cut him off instantly. I set the yellow pad on the table and made my position crystal clear. I reiterated that I was never wearing their corporate badge again. I was not giving them access to my newly built infrastructure just because they finally realized my absence had severe consequences. He nodded slowly. He knew he had absolutely zero leverage. He asked what I was willing to offer. I smiled and flipped to the second page of my legal pad. It was a long, devastating list of demands, a 10-year exclusive vendor contract with mandatory annual price escalators, complete branding autonomy for Titan Polymers, the absolute right to veto any executive appointment in their supply or logistics departments, 15% to equity in their emerging tech subsidiary, and finally, a legally binding clause that would make Julian's name an immediate red flag on any future hiring or operational document. Mr. Vance stared at the list. He blinked, wiped his brow, and whispered that it was a massive demand. I leaned in and told him it was not a demand, it was a consequence. He signed the paper right there in the booth. He did not even try to haggle. As he slid the contract back to me, I saw the absolute defeat in his eyes. He realized he had not just lost a veteran employee, he had minted his own king. By the time the second quarter reports were published, my holding company was operating in 6 states across 3 time zones. I was quietly fueling the massive machines that Apex Dynamics thought would keep running forever without me. I did not need a corner office or a fancy title. I had built a master switchboard. Every major order, every critical shipment, every pivot in their logistics strategy now passed through hands with grease under the nails and my name on the ledger. Their quarterly shareholders meeting was a complete disaster. It was a comedy show with depressing charts. Revenue had flatlined completely. Client churn was spiking to dangerous levels. One brave analyst on the call flat out asked if it was true that their core supplier now owned a partial stake in their future tech wing. There was a long, agonizing silence on the call. Shortly after that meeting, Julian's name was officially removed from the executive registry. There was no farewell memo, no tearful human resources email. He simply evaporated from the corporate truck structure. Rumor had it he tried to interview at a tech startup on the East Coast and was laughed out of the room when the hiring manager recognized the Titan Polymers veto clause on his resume. My clause had him blacklisted by proxy. It was poetic justice. Sure, but I was not entirely finished. I needed a grand finale, something slow, humiliating, and completely irreversible. Enter phase 2 of my master plan. I partnered with Silas, a brilliant engineer who owed me a massive favor, to develop a modular replacement system for the exact custom casing that Apex Dynamics used for their flagship product. Our new design had significantly better specifications and cost 20% less to manufacture. I filed the patent exclusively under my name. Then I offered it first to Apex's biggest industry rival. Within 2 weeks, a massive licensing deal was signed. The press release hit the industry wires like an explosive device. It announced a breakthrough partnership for next-generation manufacturing that completely disrupted existing supply models. The news was absolutely everywhere. Trade blogs, investor groups, and internal corporate memos were panicking, using words like catastrophic exposure, because that one specific product was Apex's ultimate cash cow. It was their shiny toy, and I had just built a superior version for their sworn enemy. The absolute best part was watching Apex realize their position. They had to call me directly to license the new design just to stay relevant in the market. Mr. Vance's voice actually cracked over the phone when he made the offer. He desperately said they were willing to pay well above the market rate. I casually reminded him that he already paid the ultimate price the day he gave Julian the power to fire his most valuable asset. I faxed him the licensing quote at triple the standard rate. There was no reply for 3 days, but later that week a massive wire transfer landed in my holding account. They paid the full amount with zero negotiation. And just like that, the empire that fired me was paying me exorbitant rent just to survive in their own industry. Meanwhile, I was 3 states away, enjoying a quiet fishing trip with Silas. I watched the sun set over the lake while sipping premium bourbon from a thermos I used to keep hidden under my old desk, the exact same desk that once held my termination papers. The circle was finally complete, but this time, I held all the power. Late last Friday, I received a thick envelope in the mail. It had an embossed seal from the Apex Dynamics Board of Directors. Inside was a formal, engraved invitation to their annual executive retreat in the mountains. The theme of the retreat was resilience in modern enterprise. They actually wanted me to be the keynote speaker. They wanted me to share my journey and inspire their next generation of corporate leaders. I laughed so hard my ribs ached. These were the exact same people who watched me get escorted out of the building like spoiled milk. The same cowards who nodded along while Julian preached his arrogant gospel about eliminating dead weight. And now, they wanted me to give them a motivational speech on survival. I did not send a reply. Instead, I bought out the entire ski lodge located right next door to theirs. I booked it for the exact same weekend. I sent invitations to every small vendor, contractor, and supplier they had ever underpaid, ignored, or threatened with restructuring. We called our event the Supply Chain Revival. At our kickoff dinner, I raised a glass and toasted to the quiet workers they called replaceable. I toasted to the veterans they forgot had teeth, and to the arrogant boy kings who thought corporate crowns were simply handed down. Meanwhile, across the mountain, Julian, if he even managed to show up, was probably sitting in the back row of a depressing seminar about future-proofing. I had a snowmobile, 3 lucrative new contracts on the table, and a roaring fireplace full of old Apex corporate agendas that I had printed specifically to burn. That night, I stepped outside onto the balcony with a drink. I looked across the snowy ridge toward their lodge. The lights were glowing dimly. I wondered if they ever truly understood what happened. I was not the hero of some underdog redemption arc. I was the absolute consequence of forgetting who built the damn walls in the first place. Julian thought firing me was a clean cut to save money. He did not realize I was the main artery, and when you sever the main artery, the body bleeds out. Now they were bleeding permanently, and I owned the only blood bank in town.